This is the Deep Dive. I'm Jonathan Hessen, and for today's edition, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Doran, the director here at Hudson Institute of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. I keep
it's quite a mouthful.
Focusing that, indeed. But senior fellow indeed, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me. So it's a delight to have you here at Hudson.
It's a delight being here, indeed. A little jet lagged, but we'll get through that. Mike, I'd like to start with a challenging question. Israel is obliged to ensure that the atrocities committed on October 7th, in which 1,200 mostly civilians were butchered, a massacre that Jews in particular, but Israel as well, has not seen since its inception, and Jews since the Holocaust. Over 4,800 wounded in one day, and 246 have been kidnapped. 134 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. And Jerusalem is quite clear. The defense establishment, there is unanimous understanding that in order to defeat the Islamist Hamas, which is a fundamental pivot in ensuring that those atrocities would never be committed again, it needs to enter into Rafah and eliminate the remaining 4 battalions operating under Hamas command there. Why is the United States so opposed to this situation?
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's really fascinating, given that the Biden administration supported the Israelis all the way up to this point. And when really pushed, they never said it, but when really pushed, or they rarely said it, I should say, but when really pushed, they would admit that all of the things that they say they want, two-state solution, a new regime in Gaza that will be responsive to the people and so on, all of that is predicated on the defeat of Hamas. But really, there's 2 different positions now. The Israeli position is unconditional surrender of Hamas and total defeat. It's total defeat. It's military defeat and it's political defeat. And of course, the political defeat is predicated on the military defeat. And the Americans are not just saying don't go into Rafah. If you put together all their statements, they're really saying they want a negotiated end to the war. They don't want total defeat. They want a negotiated end to the war.
How is that?
How is it that I've got to that conclusion, or how is it or why is it that they want that?
Let's go with the first and then subsequently the latter.
Well, they are calling for a ceasefire, and they want a prolonged ceasefire. The plans that are on the proposals that are on the table are going to take us to 46, 50 days, even longer, depending on how the deal is structured.
Roughly 6 weeks.
Roughly 6 weeks. But clearly, they want an end to the fighting. If you listen to what they're saying, they want an end to the fighting. And they're hoping to extend that ceasefire all the way, I think, to the election. To
build upon it in order to.
To build upon it in order to. And I think they've made that pretty clear. I don't have the exact quote. I think President Biden and Antony Blinken have said, we hope we can build upon that. So that's a negotiated settlement. That's not unconditional surrender. That's what Biden said in the State of the Union address was that, again, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but he said what we want is Hamas to lay down their arms and the people responsible for October 7th to be held accountable or something like that. So who are they defining as responsible for October 7th, and what does taking responsibility for it mean? I think they probably have in mind something like what happened to the PLO in southern Lebanon when the Israelis went in the Lebanon War, and they left and went to Tunis.
What does this signal?
So they want Sinwar and his immediate entourage to leave.
Right.
But just one other point. The day after they are proposing, is not, it's not going to be they're saying that the Palestinian Authority must have a role in Gaza. But we know the balance of power between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. The role that the Palestinian Authority is going to have in the process that the Americans are outlining is a fig leaf for Hamas. And so we'll have Hamas in another guise. And Hamas is working now very hard to make sure that there is no alternative other than them. They're killing off clan leaders who are going to work with the Israelis or with the international community. So that anyone who takes a position of power in Gaza under these conditions after the war is going to be vetted, fully vetted by Hamas and probably under Hamas's thumb.
Indeed. They keep on making concrete attacks not only against Israeli forces coming after them, but as you mentioned, we spoke, of course, about the Durmush family in the past,
right?
Where one of the heads of this clan was murdered for coordinating humanitarian aid.
Yes.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you have a
because
reality,
he was coordinating the aid to recipients other than those that are approved by Hamas,
including his own family.
Yeah.
And it happens to be actually one of the largest families in the Gaza Strip, in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And it has been shunned because people don't realize, and even though it's public knowledge, and we've spoken about this also in the past, but in the election, Hamas won in the legislative election of 2006. It won 44% as opposed to roughly 40% of Fatah. So it was almost down the middle. It wasn't a big gap.
Yeah, all the predictions were that they were going to lose it, of course.
Correct.
I was in the White House at the time.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But at the same time, it brought about a reality where Fatah, which is still controlling the legislative committee in the Palestinian Authority, and of course its president Mahmoud Abbas, refused to make an orderly transition of power and brought about a reality in which Hamas forcibly took what it actually won. And that's why we are hearing Russia, China, and others saying, no, they are the legitimate rulers. How do you deal with those voices at a time when, irrespective of whether or not they define them as terrorist organizations, the atrocities committed on October 7th should never reoccur, and there should be a certain consequence for that?
Yeah, well, the United States is developing a language that allows it to say it's not doing what it's doing.
But what does it signal to U.S. allies and partners?
No, it sends a very bad signal. So to my mind, the big question is, why is the United States doing it? And I think there's a kind of conventional wisdom out there, which is built primarily on the talking points of the White House. I mean, one of them is that one talking point is they're concerned about the humanitarian cost, the large number of civilians who are dying. The other one focuses on the personality of Prime Minister Netanyahu and talks about how difficult he is. And of course, President Biden is quoted, I think, very reliably by 5 or 6 different White House staffers, which tells you it's not a leak. This is a coordinated campaign out of the White House. When 5 senior staffers say they heard President Biden say that Netanyahu is an X, or that he's a Y, some really nasty language he used for Netanyahu. This is a coordinated campaign, and supposedly the problem with Netanyahu is he's not cooperating on the day after. But of course, Biden always had a problem with Netanyahu. And when Biden came into power, he didn't want to meet with Netanyahu. So I don't think that's really a completely adequate explanation. The third part of the conventional wisdom is that the administration is worried about the election in November, particularly progressive voters who don't like Israel, don't support Israel. They are alienated by the campaign, by the support that Biden has given to the Israelis, and so the closer we get to the election, the more he's interested in signaling to them that he has their view of the Middle East. I think all of these kind of miss something. I don't think kind of miss something. They miss something, which is the administration's vision of the day after in the Middle East. They have a vision of Middle Eastern order that they are working toward, and they've been working toward since the day they came in, and that involves cooperation between the United States and Iran. Cooperation may be too strong a word. Let's just say a strategic accommodation between Iran and Israel, Iran and the United States. And when they came into power, the Biden administration, there were two countries that were, two allies that were getting in the way of their vision of the rightly ordered Middle East, and that's Saudi Arabia and Israel. They took care of Saudi Arabia. They denigrated Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, and they forced him to withdraw from Yemen. They forced him they put pressure on him to arrive at a truce with the Houthis. They took the Houthis off of the terror list. So notice the components here. Denigration of an allied leader, accommodating Iran's proxy, the Houthis, taking it off the terror list, threatening to withhold weapons to Saudi Arabia if they don't withdraw from Yemen, and then
including defensive weapons for that
including
matter.
defensive weapons. So restraining the American ally and denigrating the American ally, and then brokering a peace with Iran's proxy. The administration's policy in Lebanon is identical. The Lebanon policy today, people are not paying close attention to it, but the war in Lebanon is in some ways, in the long term, more consequential for Israel than the war against Hamas, because Hezbollah is more powerful, and it's the proxy of Iran. But the proposal that the Americans have on the table in Lebanon is Israel withdraws from territory along the border, small little border rectification it would be seen as, but tangible territorial concessions by Israel, economic aid from the international community to southern Lebanon, which means to Hezbollah. And in return, Hezbollah will agree to move some of its shock forces a little bit from the northward from the Israeli border. It's exactly the same kind of arrangement that they worked with Iran to get the Houthis and the Saudis on the same page. They're going to work this with Iran quietly on the sidelines to get the deal between Israel and Hezbollah. But the Gaza war is getting in the way of all this. And the Houthis are going to continue their actions against international shipping. Iran's other proxies and Iran itself are going to continue their actions against Israel and the United States until the Gaza war comes to an end. So the administration wants to wind down the Gaza war so they can get back to the job of organizing the Middle East according to this vision of an accommodation with Iran.
Where's the disconnect between the White House to Central Command, since CENTCOM is seemingly voicing the alarm? It has invited, among others, Thomas Friedman to travel alongside General Michael Kurilla to see firsthand, and he published his insights on the New York Times. We hear Vice Admiral Bradley Cooper voicing concern for a long time about the various challenges emanating out of Iran. And recently, in a hearing here in Washington, we saw General Kurilla in a hearing emphasize that the fact that Iran is not paying a price for the actions of all of its proxies, which it is responsible for, is threatening not only partners and allies in the region, but also the U.S. interests versus the homeland. They can
only go so far, the generals in CENTCOM, in voicing these statements that are really an effort to wake Washington up to the full threat. They can only go so far, and they pushed it, I think, as far as they can. They can say. They can come out and say things that the intelligence shows that the Iranians are more involved in this than the White House is. And they won't say then the White House is letting on, but that's what they're saying. The kinds of testimony that you described, that's about as far as they can go. I don't know. I don't have great information about exactly what's going on in the Pentagon, but historically, in the last few years, it's been pretty clear that the Pentagon isn't really itching for a fight with Iran. That may have changed since the American soldiers were killed in Jordan, and since it has to be embarrassing to our military. We're the greatest power on earth, and we have carried out Operation Prosperity Guardian to deter the Houthis. We can't deter the Houthis. That sends a terrible message to all of our.
What does it send to China?
To China, to Russia, and to all of our enemies. It sends a terrible message, and to all of our allies, it sends a terrible message. And when I think you and I talked about this, if not, we should have. That Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, went to the Chinese and asked them to use their influence in Tehran, to use their influence with the Houthis, so that if you're an American ally and you see the United States going to China and asking the Chinese to restrain the Iranians, you're telling your own allies that the real address for restraint of the Iranians is in Beijing, not in Washington. It's superpower malpractice to do this. But no, these are terrible messages. But the military writ large feels overburdened right now. There's a war in Ukraine that we're not directly involved in, but we have a big role in. And there's a threat of war in Taiwan, and that's where the military thinks the big game is. This is kind of a sideshow, and so there's a wariness to get sucked into the sideshow. And they've spent so much time, so many resources, so much blood in the Middle East, and have so little to show for it. There's a real reluctance on the part of the military to go whole hog against Iran. So there is a kind of space in the military thinking that accommodates the Iran accommodation policy of the Biden administration.
I remember when there were talks between the U.S. and Iran, track to via Switzerland and such. And at the time, it was reported that John Kerry advised Mohammad Javad Zarif
the former foreign minister,
to weather the Trump administration and wait for a more friendly administration, namely the current administration in Washington. Would that be the advice also to give to allies and partners of the United States at this stage, to weather the current administration, to wait for a future one?
You mean would proper advice be to them to hold out, just hold out, don't go too far toward China, because the next administration is going to be take a tougher line with Iran?
Well, let's see. At reality at hand, you have Saudi Arabia procuring various systems from China. You have the UAE considering the same. You have a lot of allies and partners in the region making their bets, hedging their various interests to ensure that whenever there is a hostile administration, as they term it in their own language, in Washington, they will not lose all credit within the adversaries and then be in the crosshairs of enemies such as the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Right. You know, when I worked in the White House in 2006, one of our major allies in the region made it very clear to us, to President Bush, that he couldn't take actions against Iran unless the United States could guarantee victory against Iran on President Bush's watch. And it made I learned a lot about the Middle East from that exchange, because he made it very clear that you're asking me to go out onto the battlefield, in essence, and to really, stick my thumb right in the eye of the Iranians. How do I know that you, the United States, are going to be there 6 months from now? If I'm gonna go out and fight with you, in essence, we weren't asking for fight, but metaphorically, this is what you have to realize: is that you're exposing people to you're putting them in the crosshairs of the Iranians with these policies, and you can't ask them to do it unless you can guarantee them that you're going to be there for them, really, in their hour of need. And the fact of the matter is, Jonathan, it pains me to say it, but as an American, I can't, in good faith, say to any Middle Easterner that you should really put yourself at risk because you're guaranteed that we will be there for you in your hour of need. No, you look at we are so divided among ourselves that we risk really whipsawing our allies.
How can you alter that, though? Dealing with counterterrorism, for instance, in Europe, many lawmakers had to move forward and establish the judicial framework, the legal framework, in order to deal with the war on terror. Same in the U.S. Is there something that can be done from a legislative position?
I don't think so much from a legislative position. I think it really is a matter of policy. The United States has to carry out offensive countermeasures against the Iranians, has to take all the risk on itself when it does that. It does have one ally, Israel, that I think would gladly. We've seen the Israelis time and again have hit high-value Iranian targets in Syria. They will not hit, the Americans will not hit, again, even when the Iranian proxies are hitting Americans directly, we will not counterattack and hit Iranians. We won't hit them in Iran ever, but we certainly won't hit Iranian liaison officers in Yemen or Iraq or elsewhere. Because out of what they say, fear of escalation. The Israelis will do it, but we won't. That sends quite an amazing message, though. The Israelis have no fear of escalation with the Iranians, but the limits that the Israelis have to respect, particularly in Lebanon, are limits set by the Americans. Because the Americans,
not only in Lebanon.
Yeah, in Lebanon and in Gaza are set by the Americans, not by the Israelis are not limiting themselves because of fear of the Iranian escalation. They're limiting themselves because the Americans don't want don't want Iran to escalate against America. So my point here is that the United States has to reverse that. It has to carry out offensive countermeasures, and it has to support Israel in the conduct of offensive countermeasures. Israel is the one exception in the region. It's the country that will go out on the battlefield and will take on risk on its own, even if the United States won't guarantee its security.
For how long, though? Because if you look from a Middle Easterner perspective, the Middle East regards Israel as an extension of the United States.
Yep.
And therefore, when Israel does something like this, they automatically understand that the United States is not constraining Israel specifically on those matters. So to what degree can Middle Eastern countries apply additional pressure on the United States, which is currently, under the current administration, unwilling to assume the leadership role which is expected of the U.S., irrespective of whether it wants it or not, to follow through on constraining Israel even further?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I think the administration its calculations are misguided, is it thinks it gets credit from all the Middle Easterners by distancing itself from Israel. When in fact, when it supports Israel, it enhances its own power. And some of the Middle Easterners might complain about it, but they will respect it, which is what you want. You want to be respected above all else. The Americans think, there's a tendency in American thinking to think that the Muslims in the Middle East don't like us because we're close to Israel. But I think it's more the fact, as you said it, that Muslims see Israel as an extension of the United States. It's not us. When the United States distances itself from Israel, it's like you might feel if you're talking to a friend and your friend starts complaining about his own children. And you might look at the children and think there's a lot to complain about there, but there's something unseemly about a father who publicly denigrates his own children. And even more unseemly if a child denigrates his father in public. Do you see what I mean? Am I making sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What's even worse, when the Middle East looks at Iraq and it looks at Syria, and it sees dozens upon dozens upon dozens of attacks against U.S. forces, and the U.S. does nothing.
Yeah.
So it's not only about Israel, it's
No,
about
it's
U.S.
about,
forces
it's respecting
in the region as
yourself.
well.
It's about respecting yourself. We have to respect ourselves, and we have to respect our allies, who are an extension of ourselves. That's the Israelis and the Saudis.
We have roughly 1.5 minutes. What should alter in the several weeks and months ahead in order to bring about a change in perception, even by the current administration in Washington?
Offensive countermeasures against Iran. We have to show that we are not afraid. We keep telling when I say we, I'm saying the Biden administration, in its public messaging, it says we are afraid of escalation. The minute you say to a rapacious thug like Khamenei, I'm afraid of escalation with you, he says, okay, I'm going to escalate. That's true of, I think sometimes, did nobody ever beat these guys up on the playground? Because it's not, the logic here is not, you don't have to have a PhD to understand the logic. It's really pretty simple. It's the logic of the thug. It's the logic of force. That is how the international system works. It's always worked that way. Why do we, the most powerful country on earth, not realize that? When we are attacked by powers that are much weaker than we are, and when they show everyone in the region that they can attack us with impunity, we're only calling down more trouble on ourselves.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Michael Doran, it's always a pleasure.
Great to be here.
I'd like to thank all of you at home as well until our next edition. This time from here in Washington. Have a good evening.
The Middle East, home to the cradle of civilization, retains a reputation from time immemorial as one of the most complex, conflict-ridden regions of the world. A cluster of nations, religions, powers, and influences, Mideast intricacies pose conundrums to even the most astute individuals. Bombarded daily, indeed every minute, by a barrage of information, some accurate, yet most of it less so, TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of whom partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio every Tuesdays and Fridays for content that truly matters.